Good morning, everyone. My name is Alex Cruzel, CEO and founder of Telesto Strategy. We work every day towards a vision to regenerate the planet, and we are especially focused on the question of climate capital. Our enduring commitment leads us to bring those like our speaker today, global thought leaders, decision makers, actors in the climate capital space, where we look to drive to new solutions, new ideas, and help mitigate the gap that we're seeing to drive to global climate outcomes. I'll start with a brief intro to what this space is, very high level to set a common frame, a common lexicon, and what we're seeing as a principal challenge very briefly, and then I'll hand it over to my colleague, Andrew, who will introduce our featured speaker. So climate finance is more in the news today than ever. We're seeing a tremendous amount of growth with a lot more to come. In recent years, the growth has been, as you can see here, very, very strong. But according to the best data that we have, it's still not enough. To meet the Paris Agreement and to keep global warming to 1.5, we have a lot of work to do. And it takes a lot of money and finance and creativity and connectivity to get there. We have a tremendous gap. And the question we want to explore today, amongst others, is sort of what are some of these blockers and what can be done about it, and learn from those who are leading the way. So question, right? What is preventing countries from attracting a greater share of climate capital? Again, I'll briefly cover a few high levels that I know we're going to go much deeper on, but to provide a frame. On the investor side, again, a limited set of knowledge and understanding a pipeline, an unsure amount of investment opportunities, the risk appetite is not calibrated. On the recipient side, it's understanding the landscape and availability of climate inflows. It's accessing and selling what they're capable of, their stories and competencies and opportunities to international investors. And again, maybe a limited country set or availability of technical assistance. What we're trying to do today, what we've been trying to do yesterday and tomorrow, is build that connective tissue. And so today we convene many leaders in the space, and we'll go into a lot more detail about how we can build this connective tissue. A frame of reference, right? Climate finance is tricky because it requires a portfolio of actors. We need actors in the public financing space. We need actors in the private financing space. And we're seeing a number of tools and instruments that are used to make these opportunities, investable projects, into actual outcomes that are climate driven. And so this is a common, I'm not going to go into all of these. This is a reference, and we're happy to share these too with anyone who's interested, of some of the things we're going to be going into more detail about. So I'm really excited to hear from, again, our featured speaker, and momentarily to see where do they fit into this equation? How do they put this puzzle together? Just a little bit about Telesto before I hand it over. We have a long-term and enduring commitment to the climate finance space. Some recent highlights include our convenings, really alongside the US Department of State, whether it was a San Francisco Tech Leaders convening, official side event at the margins of the US Africa Leaders Summit, a White House event in DC in December. More recently, working with the State Department for their climate capital convening in Accra, and a private sector delegation. And we're working every day to build that connective tissue. We look forward to more such events, both virtually and in person, and we'll keep this group abreast of what's next. And then finally, for those who haven't intersected with Telesto yet, we have a number of ways that we work with those on their ESG, sustainability, and climate finance journeys. And so there's a number of instances where we work with partners who are just getting started. We help them with the transformation. We think about new financial instruments and how we deploy those. We help build net zero roadmaps, and we make sure we integrate sustainability at the highest level of an organization. And at the same time, we make sure we equip any organization with the data management that's needed to actually drive the impact we all hope to see. With that background on the climate capital space, the problems we're looking to solve, the most important actors who can drive these results, I think there's no better way than to sort of hand over the mic and set the stage for a featured guest. So over to you, Andrew.
Thanks very much, Alex, and thanks everyone for joining. So our featured guest today is Diep Nguyen-Van Houtte, who is a senior manager for climate innovation and business development at the International Finance Corporation, also known as IFC. IFC is a member of the World Bank Group, and it's also the largest global development institution, which is focused on the private sector and emerging markets. As a member of IFC's management team, Diep leads the development, dissemination, implementation, and monitoring of IFC's climate strategy across industries and sectors. In this capacity, she engages with thought leaders and decision makers within the World Bank Group and externally to foster innovative thinking about creating new instruments and markets for climate finance, and to source projects in developing economies to increase private investment in climate-friendly technologies, businesses, sectors, and markets with significant impact. Diep, we're really excited to have you here. I understand that you will grace us with some interesting slides first, and then we can get into a conversation where we'll ask you a few questions about your background and the work that you're getting involved in.
Thank you, Andrew, for that nice introduction, and thank you everyone for joining today. I'm always happy to talk about climate and private financing. And then, I will only share a few slides to give you a flavor and a basic understanding of what the IFC does, but I'm really looking forward to the conversation with the participants here today. So the IFC is the private sector arm of the World Bank Group. The World Bank finances governments for development projects, and the IFC finances companies. As the World Bank Group, we are the largest financier of developing projects around the world. Let me just see why okay, there we go. Andrew, can you confirm that you're seeing this slide properly?
We're seeing it perfectly. Thanks, Diep.
Excellent. So you can see here on this slide, so the World Bank Group is the largest financier of development projects around the world. And by development, we mean projects with a positive impact on beneficiaries. We finance the roughly 140 or so countries around the world that qualify for what we call overseas development assistance, according to the OECD's definition. So it means we finance projects. We cannot finance projects that are based in the United States or Canada or Australia, Japan, Korea, and Western Europe, but that still leaves over 140 countries around the world where we can finance. We can finance, for example, American investors in the wealthier countries. We can finance them. Companies that are based in America, for example, we can finance, but the projects themselves or the investments themselves have to be in what we call emerging markets or developing countries. In this slide here, you see that there are 5 entities to the World Bank Group. IBRD is the part of the World Bank that makes loans to middle-income countries or governments. And IDA are basically the part of the World Bank that makes interest-free loans or grants to very poor countries. Some examples of countries that qualify for these IDA interest-free or very low interest loans are, for example, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, many countries in Africa, Afghanistan, Nepal. Middle-income countries that qualify for IBRD financing are, for example, Vietnam, Brazil, Colombia, Poland. And then you see in the middle, the IFC, which makes loans or grants, but mostly loans to private sector companies for projects in emerging markets. MIGA is our insurance company. MIGA basically provides guarantees for foreign direct investments and for non-commercial risks. Some of the risks include political risk of war in any of the countries where we invest. MIGA also covers payment risk, credit risk as well. And then we have the Independent Tribunal for Investment. And as I mentioned earlier, IFC is the largest global development institution focused on private sector investment in emerging markets. We are on the ground. We have offices in more than 100 countries. We provide not only investment services, but also advisory services. And we have a AAA credit rating, and our members are the 186 countries. Our two key objectives in development are, one, to create markets, which means where there isn't investments in a certain sector, let's say for renewable energy, for example, or say in Africa, say more than 60 million people don't have access to electricity, then we try to go there and develop markets, make sure that invest in projects and companies that could help increase access to electricity in Africa and other markets. Mobilizing the private sector, we typically invest about 20% to 35% of the total capital investment of any project, because our job is to crowd in private sector investment, not to replace private investment. So we would invest, like I said, 1/5 to 1/3 of the total capex of a project, but then we will bring in other private investors. We're crowding in additional private investment. So we tend to be the lead arranger who will leverage mobilization platforms and bring in other private investors. So I mentioned earlier, we provide investment products such as loans. We also do equity investments, derivatives and structured finance, so mezzanine, and trade and commodity finance. We do blended finance, and that means for projects that are not commercially viable on their own, not quite bankable, we have de-risking instruments. We will have concessional resources from donors, from partners, and we will use those grants or concessional financing from our partners to lower the cost of borrowing for our partners. And we also have de-risking instruments such as guarantees. And we provide advisory support to develop capacity in countries or with clients who don't quite have the capacity to develop an interesting project or help solve problems to bankability. So for example, let's say we want to invest in a green hydrogen project or an offshore wind project. Well, if the legal or regulatory framework in that particular country is not yet facilitating such investments, we would work with those governments to change the law or to update the legal framework to allow investments in such sectors. And we also help solve problems, other problems to bankability, such as environmental and social safeguards issues, licensing issues, and then financial bankability. And then we not only invest off our own balance sheet, but we also mobilize other investments from other investors. We have our own asset management company that can invest alongside us. We syndicate, and we basically have a huge network of other financiers. So we can easily bring in, for worthy investment that we invest in, we can easily bring in other investors. This just lists our, we work with countries, so those are sovereign partners, and then we work with foundations to bring in blended finance, foundations and bilateral donors, and then we work with multilateral such as the European Bank, IDB, African Development Bank. So we have a wide network of partners. So let me just quickly go into our climate strategy. The World Bank Group's Climate Change Action Plan for the years 2021 to 2025 basically says we have to align 100% with the Paris Agreement goals by July 2025, which is not far off. It's just 2 years from now. And by this summer, 100% of World Bank projects already have to align. 85% of the private sector investments have to align. Increase World Bank Group climate finance to 35% of average overall flows. So far at the IFC this year, we've already exceeded that target. 35% is the minimum, but we're continually striving to exceed that. And we prioritize the transition of 5 key systems that generate 90% of GHG emissions. And I'll talk a bit about them later. So the core climate business sectors at the World Bank include, World Bank Group and IFC include clean energy, manufacturing, green buildings and cities, green finance, and climate smart agribusiness. These are the 5 areas I mentioned earlier. And I also mentioned earlier that we offer blended finance solutions, which means we use grant financing from partners to de-risk and help projects get to bankability. And I'm going to skip all of these because they are a bit too technical, but I'll just cover the areas that we invest in. So we have 3 key industry groups at the IFC. The first here is, we call it FIG internally, but what it means is financial intermediaries or banks, financial intermediary group. We basically finance through commercial banks or capital market vehicles or fintechs and leasing companies that allows us to aggregate and finance smaller businesses such as SMEs. Projects that would not be financeable. We're large institutions, so we normally would not finance directly small businesses or SMEs, but we can go through banks and set up, say, green bonds to finance SMEs. We have so far financed 459 billion in SME loans. Let's see, the sectors that we invest in through banks are basically all sectors that have positive climate impact, such as renewable energy, rooftop solar, for example, housing, basically green. We have a program called Edge Green Buildings. And Edge Green Buildings is a program that requires that all new buildings, whether it be commercial, industrial, or residential housing, for example, save on electricity, water use, as well as carbon captured in the building materials. So the first level of Edge Green Building certification is for the new buildings to achieve 20% savings in energy use, water use, and captured carbon. And if you get that certification, you can qualify for green bonds, preferential borrowing rates from a bank that's issuing that green bond. So that's the housing sector. We also, the other sectors that we finance include insurance, trade finance, small and medium enterprises and entrepreneurs, and businesses owned by women. And like for all industries, the products that we cover include loans, guarantees, equity, bonds, and mezzanine convertible instruments. And the second industry pillar that we invest in are infrastructure. So the main sectors for infrastructure include energy, such as hydropower, solar, PV projects, wind projects, battery storage, transport, electric mobility, electric vehicles is a big sector right now for transport. We're also looking at shipping, but decarbonizing shipping, say, through alternative fuels. Municipal finance is basically where we finance governments, city governments or provincial governments to finance climate-friendly projects such as public transport or wastewater reuse, recycling projects, green building projects, etc. Water provision projects or energy efficiency projects in cities. TMT is basically telecoms, media, and technology. And there we invest in basically providing telecommunications, mobile access, data access, fiber optic cables to allow the population to have access to mobile connectivity as well as Wi-Fi internet service. And as you know, digital connectivity, especially for data and Wi-Fi service, is essential to promote job creation and education services these days. And we've seen that through the COVID epidemic. Utilities, this means, for example, we would finance electric utilities, water utilities in providing water services or energy services to the population. And mining, we finance the mining of critical minerals that are needed by the world, but we also make sure that these mining projects provide benefits to the local communities. And you see here some of the companies that we have invested in, including Suez, which is a major water and waste utility, EDF, which is a French energy utility, Scatec Solar is a Norwegian utility, DP World is a port operator. And this lists the areas of focus of the infrastructure sector, some of which I already mentioned earlier. I mentioned green buildings and energy efficiency, climate change adaptation and resilience projects, e-mobility and e-logistics, mass transit projects. You see here the EDGE Green Buildings Project, and we also have APEX, which is our branded program to finance a green city action plans. In energy and transport, we invest in in battery storage projects, distributed generation, including mini grids, many of which are in Africa and Asia. Offshore wind projects, green hydrogen projects these days are also very popular. E-vehicles I mentioned earlier. And then we are trying to finance the phasing out of coal-powered power plants, but that is very tricky. And then the third pillar is our manufacturing services. So we basically finance manufacturing basically for manufacturing, we're trying to decarbonize industry, including the hard to abate sectors such as the construction materials, steel, cement. We're always looking to find ways to reduce the GHG emissions of the manufacturing process. Green buildings we mentioned earlier, and then climate smart agriculture and forestry. Of course, in agriculture, food losses is a major issue. And so we are investing in, say, cold storage technologies and logistics, transport in order to reduce the loss of food from farm to table or farm to fork. And we definitely invest in the chemicals industry as well. And for example, ammonia production is is very linked these days to green hydrogen production. We've have always invested in ammonia production, which is a key ingredient for fertilizers, which supports our agricultural industries. But these days, with the production of green hydrogen, we're able to support green ammonia production as well. And then we also have, and this will be the last slide where I discuss, and then we can have a discussion. We have a climate a venture capital arm that invests in earlier stage businesses and smaller businesses that with equity investments. So let me, Andrew and Alex, let me stop there and open the floor to questions.
Yeah, great. Thanks very much, Diep. Thanks for the very thorough overview of the IFC and also the work that IFC is doing in the climate space. I think we have a pretty good sense from that presentation, sort of what are the big objectives and how IFC approaches this. I'd be curious just to understand a little bit more, what are the major success metrics that you and the IFC are using to judge the impact that you're having in the climate space? And particularly because of the private sector approach that the IFC takes, how is that maybe different from the broader World Bank Group, who definitely also invests in the climate space, but through a different channel and a different approach?
Right. Thanks, Andrew. So we have a methodology in-house that measures our impact, the development impact that we have with all of our projects. We look at the beneficiaries, the people whom we're helping, for example, whether they're getting better access to electricity or access to water or access to transport services. But we're, from the climate perspective, we also measure GHG emissions. And we measure energy use, water use, depending on the project. But typically, all of our projects have to be Paris aligned. So we have to look at for Paris alignment, there's a very specific methodology to see if a certain sector that we work in is aligned to the Paris climate framework. So they all have to be Paris aligned. And then we measure GHG emissions, the baseline case versus the case where the project is supporting. So we do have a very detailed methodology to measure the impact.
That's great. So at each individual project level, you're sort of measuring the outcomes, and that varies depending on the specific project. At the portfolio level, you mentioned GHG emissions. Are there other targets that you're looking at sort of at a full portfolio level? And is that also inclusive, not necessarily of impact metrics, but what about financial metrics and things that speak to the private sector nature of all of this business?
Right. So certainly GHG emissions we measure. We also measure energy use for certain types of projects where that can be measured. Water use, so the uses of natural resources where we can measure, we do. The financial measures include how much of our lending is actually linked to positive, climate positive sectors. So how much of our lending is used for climate adaptation or mitigation projects. So that's a financial measure. Yes, so that's basically it. Do we align with Paris? Do we align with the Paris alignment framework? Is our capital, is our lending having a positive impact on the climate, and then GHG emissions and natural resource use?
Yeah, that's great. And I wanted to touch on something that came up in your presentation about your approach about crowding in private sector investment. I wonder if you could speak broadly about what are some of the techniques that IFC uses to ensure that it isn't crowding in rather than crowding out or replacing private sector investment, and whether or not those techniques are different in the climate space or in the renewable energy space.
So it's, I'm not sure that they are different in the climate space. So what we do in terms of mobilizing private investment is we have to prove that the IFC has additionality, or the IFC investment adds additional value. If a project is bankable on its own and can be financed by commercial banks, then we should not be financing it. We actually finance the more difficult projects. This is why we don't crowd out private investment. If on the market, commercial banks are ready to finance a specific project, then we would typically not be involved. We are a development institution. So we take on the more difficult projects, and we have to prove additionality, as in this project would probably not happen if the IFC was not involved. So that is what we call additionality. So that's one proof of not crowding out private sector investment. The second is that even for those difficult projects that require IFC investment for our additionality or our value, we would only invest, again, 20 to 35% of the total capital investment amount. And the rest we mobilize from commercial banks, other investors, so that we actually are mobilizing additional private sector investment.
And in those circumstances, are you typically taking a subordinated position to the commercial investors, or how are you positioned? Okay.
Yeah, and actually that's one key thing to remember about investing with the IFC is we are not subordinated to other investors. We tend to be the senior debt holder.
Got it. Maybe changing direction slightly now, back to the sort of higher level. In sort of trying to implement the strategy, you put up a lot of great figures in terms of the amount of investment that's been done across the various different verticals that you're working in. I wonder if you could just talk to us a little bit about some of the challenges that you and the IFC have encountered in deploying capital in the climate space over the last few years, and whether or not you see those continuing into the future.
So thanks for that. One major challenge is that because we are involved in the most difficult projects, clients tend to come to us with the difficult projects, and if they're difficult, it means other people have tried to solve them and they weren't able to. So they are challenging. Again, if the project was easy and bankable on its own, we typically would not get involved. We leave it to the commercial banks, to the market. So one key challenge for us is in many of these emerging markets or developing countries, the capacity is very low. So there are many companies that want to invest in a certain sector, but they don't have the knowledge or the skills or the staff with the knowledge and skills. That's one challenge. The second is the legal and regulatory framework in that country is not conducive to investment in this particular sector. So maybe you need a license or a permit to invest in this sector, and that has not, the legal framework for that has not been defined. Land acquisition is a major issue for the large infrastructure projects. We pay a lot of attention to environmental and social safeguards factors. We have stringent environmental and social safeguards rules, and that's a challenge for many projects and clients. And quite frankly, a lot of these projects are just difficult. They're not bankable on their own. So for example, these days, offshore wind projects or formerly hydropower projects, they're big projects. The new sector is green hydrogen. And even many electric mobility public transport projects. These are not bankable on their own. They require de-risking, they require subsidies from governments. And so for those projects, we need to help bring in what we call blended finance. And what that means is subsidies from donors to buy down the cost of these projects, or to provide guarantees and other de-risking instruments to make them investable for private investors.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks for that. So just to summarize, you sort of boiled it down to three major challenges. One would be about the capabilities of the project teams that you're working with. You get brought the tough projects. The second would be sort of everything that is the enabling environment around investment, in particular investment in climate stuff. And then the last bit is the technical viability of some of these projects being maybe not quite bankable yet. On the
And maybe
first
let me add a fourth,
Yeah, sure.
Andrew, let me add a fourth, which is many of the markets that we work in have rather poorly developed local capital markets. And it would help to have strengthened or stronger capital markets for the availability of local currency. For example, there is, we tend to lend in the US dollar. And so if you're investing in a project in the US dollar and there's a devaluation in the local currency, there's foreign exchange and currency risk associated with that. And so having a strong capital market, domestic capital market, would actually help with hedging instruments. But many of the countries that we work in don't quite have mature domestic capital markets yet.
Right. No, I can see that being a major challenge. I wanted to touch on the capabilities and enabling environment ones, because I think, this is something that we've heard come up a lot in conversations with other people who are active in the climate capital space. I can see how through the services, the advisory services that IFC provides, you're trying to directly target this, of the capabilities of the project teams. I'm wondering if you're thinking that's enough, or there's a greater need that really we need to somehow lift up broadly across all these different projects that are coming to life in the developing world, the capabilities of the project teams. And if so, how do we do this beyond sort of on a deal by deal basis?
Yes, no, it's definitely a challenge that requires the collaboration of everyone, of all of the development partners, of all the governments, agencies. We do, other than a project by project basis, we do offer some public goods products. So we do a lot of training, knowledge sessions. But one key public good that we offer is the EDGE Green Building certification process, where we train local trainers, certifiers, and we don't necessarily need to provide the financing for a new building, a new project, whether it be a new industrial center, a new office building, a new hotel, or a new housing complex. But we manage the tool, the EDGE Green Building tool, to help builders and developers and even homeowners who want to have a greener, more efficient building. We provide that service as a public good. So we provide the training, the tool that you can access online, and anybody can get their building certified.
Great. And enabling environment, does IFC play much of a role in speaking directly with government entities, or are you more relying on your World Bank Group colleagues to do that?
We do. We can talk directly to governments and express to governments the view from private sector investors and developers on what's needed to invest in certain sectors or projects. But we also, at the same time, systematically partner with our World Bank colleagues to conduct dialogue with governments, because our World Bank colleagues, that's what they do on a daily basis as part of their operations. They conduct dialogue with governments about policies for development projects.
Yeah, and do you find ever that, for example, the potential for a very large IFC project can sometimes move the needle with a host country government in terms of thinking through the enabling environment?
Absolutely. In fact, I would say that most, if not all, of our projects need to move the needle. That's the test that we need to prove to the board, that additionality factor that I mentioned. So, for example, the IFC was among the first investors in the solar PV sector, in solar parks. The largest, we were there from the beginning. I think over 20-something years ago, we invested in the first and largest solar PV project in India. The Ben Solar Park in Egypt is also among the world's largest, and we were an investor there too. And when we invest, we come in, we tend to open up a market, and then other investors and similar investments follow.
Right. Makes a lot of sense. Diep, I want to change directions just slightly to talk a bit more about what it's like to work with the IFC from an investee's angle or an entrepreneur's angle. So you mentioned needing to have every project be aligned with the Paris framework. Can you just maybe more comprehensively lay out for us what are the requirements that the IFC will ask of a potential borrower before the IFC says we're ready to go and we're ready to ink this deal?
I see. Okay. So first we will ask, what is the project? What is the project, or what is the objective of the investment or the project? So we will, we have not only investment officers who are experienced, but we have industry specialists with deep technical expertise in every sector. So we will look at the project, ask the basics about the project. We then also, and again, environmental and social safeguards factors we pay attention to. So if a project looks too risky from an environmental safeguards or social safeguards perspective, we will not invest in it. We will look at the investee company or the potential investors. We have something called the integrity due diligence check. And that's where we have a systematic way using existing databases, but our own checks as well, of checking on whether the investors have any issues, whether they have integrity issues, whether they have, for example, made bribes or been accused of corruption in the past, whether they are a politician or connected to a politician. So we call those PEPs, politically exposed persons. That is something we also are careful of. We don't invest in anything associated with the military or defense, and we don't invest in the tobacco products. So there are several factors that we look at in terms of the integrity due diligence check. We also look at the strength of the investor or investee company. So how long has that company been around? What is their annual turnover? What's their revenue? Are they turning a profit? And so the strength of the company is important. And that is because we invest off our own balance sheet. And if we make the wrong bet, we also lose money. And our objective as a long-term development institution is we do need to make money so that money that we get back, we can reinvest in other development projects.
And can you talk to us a little bit more about the environmental and social angle? I think some of the conversations we've heard or been a part of in the developing world with entrepreneurs is that, especially for very young entrepreneurs, they understand the financial diligence, they understand the integrity diligence stage, but this environmental and social impact angle and the ways of demonstrating that they are having that or that they are concerned about that internally can sometimes be a bit of a challenge for them. What can an entrepreneur who's quite young and just trying to figure out how to run a business do to ensure that they're demonstrating impact in those respects while still managing the other side of the house, which is their core business model?
Well, I mean, in terms of environmental and social factors, we have a standard methodology that we look at. We have what we call performance indicators or the performance measures for our environmental and social framework. So let's take say land acquisition. If you are, say, developing a solar park or a wind farm, you need to acquire land. And so we look at how you acquired that land. Did you buy that land from existing landowners? And if so, did you follow the rules of the country? Did you make a fair payment for that land? And, if people needed to be resettled for a project, did you follow the procedures of notification, public consultation? Did you make a fair payment? So it is an onerous process for a lot of people. And so again, the project has to be high value and worthwhile. And if chances are small businesses or SMEs would not be able to follow these procedures, but we do provide help, and many companies, even the big companies, engage us for our expertise in following environmental and social safeguards rules.
Great. Just continuing this vein of looking at things from the investee angle. I mean, this is partly a question from the audience, actually. I mean, can you describe how an entrepreneur would even go about beginning a relationship with the IFC? How do they get started? What does that process look like?
Okay. Well, so if an entrepreneur has a project that they think is great, they can contact the first thing to do is contact someone at the IFC. So, and chances are it's best to contact someone who's locally based first. So for example, if you have a project in Brazil, you would contact people located in the Sao Paulo office, our Brazil office. Or if you have a project in Kenya, you would contact our Nairobi office. And then to get more granular, if it's a project in manufacturing, you would contact someone who's working in manufacturing based in Kenya, if the project is in Kenya. And vice versa. So you look, you find the people who work in that specific sector. If you don't know who works now, our website should have plenty of information. If you just search and put in the sector, the country, then chances are you will find some point of contact. But if not, the best way to do it is just to contact the local office. And if it's a global program and it's not associated with the local office, you can always contact the global people based in Washington, D.C. Again, if you search, you will find my name for climate financing or even for investments in infrastructure, in manufacturing. But someone at IFC should be able to guide you to the right person to talk to. And then that's when you schedule a meeting, you describe your project, and then you have a discussion.
Great. So I wanted to change gears to talk a little bit more about the blended finance or concessional financing that the IFC does. And in particular, there are a couple of questions from the audience on this. Blended finance becoming a really hot topic in climate capital these days for all the reasons you mentioned about supporting projects that are otherwise unbankable. And for a lot of new climate ventures, that is often the case due to technology, due to a variety of different other reasons. Can you talk about what are the common reasons that blending finance agreements fail to materialize?
Oh, that's again, blended finance is a tricky mix, right? It really depends on the project and the sponsor, and whether the project is in a sector that our donors want to finance. Again, because blended finance means we're getting donor funds to subsidize the project, to buy down the cost of the project or to de-risk the project. So the most successful ones are the ones that are in priority sectors. So for example, these days, the priority sectors are the ones that have positive climate impact, climate adaptation and mitigation projects, climate resilience projects. So these days, energy efficiency projects, renewable energy projects, distributed generation projects that provide access to electricity to poor people. So basically they should be in priority sectors that donors want to finance. And these days it's basically projects that have positive climate impact. Again, the sectors that I mentioned, decarbonization of industry sectors, access to electricity, e-mobility, those renewable energy. These are the sectors that donors want to invest in and would be providing the blended finance to make them bankable. The second is, again, blended finance is a challenge, but we also have a shortage of bankable or investable projects, even with blended finance. So structuring a good project that is investment ready is quite tricky and takes time. And so having experienced developers and investors is quite key. And sometimes we do get approached by companies who have a great idea, but don't have the capacity or don't have an investor that we would invest with. And so sometimes we do that matchmaking. When we see a great idea that's worthy of investment, we will help that entrepreneur or that investor find a partner, that a developer or a financier that could help make that project, help develop that project and make it bankable.
So it sounds like there are a lot of very specific characteristics that need to come into alignment for blended finance to be the right approach for a given project. You know, in this circumstance of there's a lot of unbankable projects in climate capital space. Many of them are not suitable even to blended finance, which is supposed to be the sort of safety net for these unbankable projects. We have this huge need in some of the slides that Alex projected earlier, that we have this huge gap between where we need to be and where we are in terms of deploying capital. What, to your mind, can we be doing more to accelerate the closing of that gap then?
I think we all need to work together, several things, work together to develop the local domestic capital market, to develop skills. And so that's all about the development challenges, ensure that the education system is developing the skills that are necessary, but also giving equal access to education and skills development. We need to raise more blended capital. There is not sufficient blended capital out there. And then we need to find models that can scale up certain investments rather than just a project by project basis. Find models that are more easily scalable across geographies. It is a challenge. I'm not sure that I have all the answers, and we look for them in every single sector that we work in. But everybody's thinking about this, and again, because developing projects is so difficult, it's a combination of factors. Getting blended finance is one thing, but then also how do we develop projects faster? So it requires all of those ingredients and not just one or the other.
Yeah. Do you sort of see all these pieces developing on their own? I mean, you said we all need to come together to do this. Are there, amongst those pieces that you named, which ones do you feel are being given sufficient attention currently, and you feel optimistic about their ability to be fulfilled in the coming years, and which do you think need additional attention and we need to redouble our efforts on?
Yeah. Look, I think really industry, private sector players have to really have positive intent to really try to solve the climate challenge. We can do everything that we can as donors, as development institutions, but if the private sector companies that are out there, especially the bigger ones, let's say the energy developers, or say Maersk for shipping, or the airport operators, if they don't want to do it and they don't collaborate with us, then it's not going to happen. Innovation tends to happen in the private sector. And so if the incentives that are out, if incentives are out there, and if there's good intent from private sector players, then things will move a lot faster. It's a lot faster for us to help move things along rather than having to fight things along the way. So one key ingredient is if government provides a sufficient legal framework, an enabling environment, and incentives for private sector investment. So one great example is the IRA for the US. The IRA has just done leaps and bounds in terms of providing incentives for investments in the renewable energy sector and e-mobility and all the climate positive sectors. So just with the IRA passing, I've seen more private sector investments in renewable energy, green hydrogen, green transport, electric vehicles than any time in the past. So government's role is to provide the right incentives and legal and regulatory frameworks for private investment. But at the same time, the private sector has a huge role. They have to have positive intent and they have to want to help solve the climate challenge. The innovations happen in the private sector, and we need all of the private sector companies to help solve this problem.
Great. I'm conscious we're coming up on time, so I'll ask one last question. What can we expect to see from IFC and the World Bank Group at COP28?
Well, I'm one of the organizers of COP28
Perfect. We got just the right person.
For the IFC and the World Bank Group. So look, I can tell you what the big topics are. Again, everyone is trying to solve the blended finance challenge, how to get more blended finance. Energy transition is definitely a big topic. Hard to abate sectors, how to and linking to that, reducing the GHG emissions of construction materials, increasing the number of green buildings and green cities. That's another big topic. So let's see, energy transition, green buildings and green cities, and cooling. I mean, with the hotter planet, we have to think about cooling. So, sustainable cooling solutions is also big. But basically, these are the topics that we're thinking about, and we're thinking, and of course, how to come up with blended finance solutions and provide more resources to accelerate the development of these climate adaptation and mitigation projects.
Great. Well, thank you for the sneak preview. We feel particularly special to have been given that little insight into what the big topics are going to be from the IFC and the World Bank Group. Diep, thank you so much for taking the time to do this and for providing really insightful discussion points. Thanks again.
Thank you, Andrew, and you did a great job facilitating. Thanks, Andrew. Thanks, Alex, for inviting me. It's always a pleasure. And again, I think these things become a lot more understandable when you actually interact with us on a very particular project. Then you hear all the peculiarities, or you understand it a lot better. Otherwise, it still seems, I can understand how it could still seem like rocket science at a higher level without a specific project. But I'm always happy to interact and answer questions. If you have a specific project, don't hesitate to contact.
Thanks again, Diep.
And have a great day, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.